Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage!
Hey folks, I realize I haven't given you much of a break lately as far as me doing my videos. Let's blame boredom, okay? I haven't done one for a couple days, but I know people are still catching up, understandably. My last video had very few views, and it's just, I think people are overwhelmed and I'm just putting a lot of them up there, so look at it as not necessarily a timely thing. You know, there's probably not a whole lot in here in these recent videos that are necessarily tied to a specific time frame. Like you have to watch this as soon as it gets put up because it's not valid otherwise or whatever. So I've been doing just random vinyl pulls. I haven't been showing much of what I've been listening to. It continues to be kind of variations because it's the warm weather and the summertime for me, and most of what I'm showing has tended to be variations on my summertime listening. So some classical, actually, you know, I listen to more classical in the summertime than any other time of year. Sometimes also going into the autumn, when the classical stuff takes on a whole different vibe. So quite often it'll spill over into the autumn time when more electronic things start taking over. So I've been all over the place with my listening. Nothing extraordinary after I did that whole video on the New Earth record label. I was listening to a lot of their artists, which are modern musicians playing modern instrumental music, but for the most part extremely influenced by traditional Indian music, though they're playing a modern variation of that. And that stuff is mainly acoustic based, with some very modern sound processing. Like all the hand percussion you hear on those records, on those New Earth things, it doesn't sound like traditional Indian music because the recording quality is very high tech. So the hand drums tend to have a very, I wouldn't say processed sound, but very modern percussion sound. And they use just a little bit of synth in the background. So that's what I've been, since that time, I haven't, my listening has been a little bit all over the place. Varying day to day, I listen to a bunch of Jan Garbarek stuff. Mainly, I tell you, a lot of my listening goes down to the fact that I used to have a couple very thick CD wallets, the kind that you take the CD out of the case and you put in a little sleeve in the wallet. And the wallets would fit, I don't know, like maybe 50 or more CDs. I had 2 or 3 of those. Now, I didn't put my CDs in there. This is for car listening. You know, the reason you want them in the CD wallets is for the portability. So when I moved, I brought them with me and I lost nearly all of them. I don't know where they went. Maybe I didn't bring them. I thought I did. What these were MP3 discs that I would make because my car will play MP3 files on a CDR, a burned CDR. So I made MP3 discs, usually all music by the same artist. Very rarely would I mix it up. So the artists that had a lot of albums by, you know, Ralph Towner, people like that. And last year or so, when I went looking for these wallets that I thought I had, I couldn't find them. So I had, I don't know, maybe like 150 burned CDRs in there. But these were MP3 discs. They had 8.5 hours approximately of music on each one. So that's anywhere from like 8 albums to 12 albums, depending on the length of the albums, on each one of these. So at one point, just prior to me moving here, I had hundreds of albums on these burned CDRs. And I don't know, I probably had something like 400 albums, maybe more, on these burned CDRs from my car. So I wasn't really making these CDRs at any fast rate at that point because I had all my favorite artists and all my favorite albums already on the MP3 discs in the car, and they're gone. So what happened now, when I really discovered, I kind of panicked. I mean, at least I didn't lose my original CDs or anything like that. But now I'm down to a little envelope that's got less, maybe 10 CDRs in them, and they're pretty much the things I've been making since just in the last year, really. So now, when you compile these things, it takes a lot of time. Because I was doing one by Jan Garbarek, for instance. Now, I have many more albums than would fit onto this 8.5-hour MP3 discs. And there's some things that I love that I might not put on there because they're too quiet, they're too low-key, not suited so much for driving around, and all the extraneous noise and everything. So there might be an album that I really love that's just so low-key that just doesn't make the cut. And I have to go through and listen to all these albums again to figure out which ones are going to make that disc. Now, in the case of Garbarek, I could probably make at least 2 of these discs just from his solo albums alone. 2 of these MP3 discs of 8.5 hours each. And then there's some of his albums which I'm not so crazy about. So I wouldn't put on there. But I go through this whole process, and a lot of times it actually takes up a lot of my listening. So instead of me hanging around the house just pulling out albums to listen to, because I'm in the mood to hear them, I'm actually kind of preparing this whole listening in my computer in the Windows Media Player, where I store all my music. And I'm just playing these albums to try to figure out which ones are going to make it onto this MP3 disc, because I only have 8.5 hours of time. I always put the albums in full. I don't just select cuts. I don't do that. I don't really create compilations. Always the full albums. And then what order do I want to hear the full albums in? So the ones that are things that are a little bit more, I like them, but they're not the kind of things I want to hear all the time, might go to the bottom of the list. And the ones that I'm always in the mood for, like Paths and Prince, the album that I think I pulled out at a random vinyl pull just a short time ago, with Eberhard Weber and John Christensen and Bill Frisell and Jan Garbarek, that quartet. That gets pretty high up on the list, if not the first album that I put on these MP3 discs. But I constantly play all these albums and decide, okay, which ones I'm not going to include. And I might have a playlist in my computer that's got 17 hours worth of music, and I'm going to whittle it down to 8.5 hours worth of full albums. Which ones am I going to include on the disc? And sometimes that actually takes up my listening for weeks, literally weeks. When I'm home and I put them on and I say, nah, this album's not making it, or it's a little bit too low key, and there's no percussion, there's no pulse to it, it's very quiet. It's not going to work when you're driving around a noisy car. I have a Jeep, so I don't know if, and I've always had kind of SUVs for a long time. I had Jeeps before that. I briefly had a car, but that was a used car I got from my sister because my vans died. Prior to that, I had 2 vans that I loved. They're big monsters when you're driving around and you don't need a full van and it's hard to park and everything, but I just love vans. But none of those cars that I had, those automobiles that I've had for the last 20 plus years, I had a little pickup before that, pickup truck. None of them are designed to really shield sound that good. Maybe cars aren't either. I think maybe cars do it better, a little bit more, simply because they're designed a bit more upscale than things like Jeeps and pickup trucks and vans. But all the automobiles I've had in these last 20 years, for the most part, have been these kind of large things. It's kind of noisy driving around. So quiet music doesn't work that well. And I give you an example, like a solo classical guitar, like a lot of Ralph Towner's things that he's done in recent years. That's going to be a little tough in a noisy car, a little tough in general to listen to while you're driving around. You definitely miss a lot of the nuances and everything, but you'll probably miss a lot of the music too, because a lot of dynamics there, and it gets even quieter at times when the guitar is playing softly, to the point that you're either turning it up so loud you're going to damage your hearing when it gets loud again, or your stereo or something. So there's a lot of thought that goes into creating these MP3 discs, and a lot of thought that I wouldn't have to deal with if I had only found the ones that I had created, like the 400 discs I've done over the years. And I know, every time I think about it, I get upset because I have these images in my head of where I could have left them in the old house before I moved out. You know, I had them just in numerous places, but they were never hidden because for the most part they were in my car. And I must have taken them out in the process of preparing to move when I came here. For some reason, taken them out of my old cars and not put them in my current car, and I don't know why I did that. So a lot of my listening at home, a lot of the time in the last year or so, has been not necessarily stuff I'm in the mood to listen to, but I go through these periods where I have days and days and days and days, if not several weeks, of just listening to whoever I decide the next artist is going to be. A couple months ago was Tangerine Dream. I wanted to make a Tangerine Dream, which is a hard thing to do, MP3 disc for my car, which was, again, 8.5 hours, somewhere in that realm. And you have to, at least in my case, I'm not going to just sporadically take things. I guess I'm anal retentive that way. I'm not going to sporadically take things from different periods of the band. I'm going to focus on a period, decide what period of the band I want, and then the better things from there. So because it was the car listening, I decided to do things that were more of their rhythmic, up-tempo, percussion-oriented stuff, which is one of my least favorite periods, but stuff that's really good to listen to in the car, and probably, in all honesty, the most aggressive music that I listen to on any kind of regular basis, and it would pretty much be car listening, not a lot of home listening. So I eventually decided on the Tangerine Dream, the Jerome Forest years, which are probably my least favorite period of the whole band, but they record so much, there's some good stuff in there. And a lot of the albums, as it turns out, looking online, have very little input, strangely enough, from Jerome Foresta, and yet it seems like Jerome's love of club and techno electronic music seemed to kind of spill over into his dad, because tunes that I thought for sure had been written by Jerome were actually written by Edgar. And there's albums that were credited to both of them, but when you go online and you look, and you'll see an album with 10 tracks, has maybe 8 of them was completely written and recorded by Edgar, and like 2 of them were recorded and written by Jerome. So it was a bit strange. Back at that period, I guess being father-son, when these recordings initially came out, they kind of gave a blank credit to Edgar and Jerome. And in later years, after Jerome left the group, it seems like not so much on the CDs, but online you can actually look to see who wrote what. So I created a Tangerine Dream disc, and by the time I had finished and gone through it and listened to all this music, I was actually sick of Tangerine Dream. I didn't want to hear them anymore. But the goal was made. I ended up selecting a bunch of albums from that period, about 8 hours worth it turned out to be. I just put the full albums on there. And I had an MP3 disc. Now, I don't really want to hear it right now because I'm sick of, after weeks of just listening to that stuff, even though this goes back a couple months. But that's the kind of thing that takes up a lot of my listening time. And if I wouldn't find them now because they're clearly not here. But if some miraculous thing happened, and I found those like 400 discs or whatever they were, it must have been, I don't know, it could have been as many as 200 MP3 discs, anywhere from 100 to 200, all with 8+ hours of music on them. If I ever came across them, I probably wouldn't have to deal with making them anymore. So now I have a very limited selection of MP3 discs in my car, but I'm slowly building them. But I don't just randomly throw things together, so I tend to listen to them a lot to figure out what albums I want to put on there. And I did one of the very few times when I put different artists on there was if you're familiar with the ECM compilations called Works that came out in the late 80s, just as CDs were coming around. ECM Records put their first compilations of their artists together. I bought not all of those, but if I'm missing one, I'm missing one or two maybe. More than I could fit onto an MP3 disc. I took those. I took the Works discs, even though a lot of them don't contain my favorite works by the artists they feature. And I did put, that's probably my single favorite MP3 disc for my car. It's got different artists, which is the one rare time I did that, but it's strictly the Works compilations by those artists. So I have, Ralph Towner and John Abercrombie and Eberhard Weber and Jack DeJohnette, and I don't think I put the Colin Walcott one on there, though I have it. That one's a lot more low key and quiet. I just got a Terje Ripdal, another one that did Works. Can't think of who else right now, but Pat Metheny, pretty obvious. Keith Jarrett, Garbrick, Jan Garbrick as well. So I have that's the rare example of the MP3 discs with different artists, but it's always the complete Works compilation albums and just the Works compilation albums. That's a good one because you get a lot of variety. Because once I tend to stick the disc in, I leave it in for at least a month, if not longer, because not doing a lot of driving, I don't get to the end of this 8.5 hour disc at the end of a month, when I would normally just go and select another one to play. So lately I've just been pretty much leaving the discs in, and sometimes, because I do such minimal driving now, it might take me 3 months to get through from beginning to end one of these discs. And also the nice thing about them, I guess it's the way the stereo's set up in the car, whatever, is that after it plays the last track, it just goes back to the first album, the first track of the first album anyway, so it's a perfect cycle all around. You wouldn't even realize you had reached the end of the disc because the player doesn't stop playing. And I don't know if I guess that's the way the car stereo's set up. It's a nice feature to have. I'm a little afraid of what's going to happen in the future now that the car's 2012. I know that they no longer make. It was always iffy if the car stereos that they made the CD players with played MP3 discs or not. Nowadays, it's gotten to the point that the new cars do not even including MP3 CD players in. So they're not going to play MP3 discs because there's no slot for a CD player. That's bad. So what they're including is just a regular old-fashioned car stereo. I guess with an input for most people it would be their phone. They would store music on their phone. But first of all, I don't have a cell phone. Second of all, I had a smartphone. The disc size would never be big enough for my music collection. And so I would be stuck with having to buy an external MP3 player, which I don't have a lot of problems with, but it seems like and it's amazing to me, it seems like they're going out of fashion. Now, as far as portable music goes, I'm a little surprised that they would go out of fashion, even with the storage on the phones. First of all, smartphones are expensive. Second of all, to get larger storage capacity costs even more. And, you know, that's good for people that have 3 albums on their smartphones worth of music, and that's it. And they can either just leave those 3 albums in or just constantly rotate stuff. But that doesn't work for me. So I understand that, and it really saddens me that portable MP3 players, which only had one of in the early days, which held almost nothing, seem to be going out of style. Which is sad because they started to, it seems like a few years ago, they got to the point where they were coming down in price, but the storage size of the hard drive was getting larger and larger. So one of the things to buy as soon as I get employed again on my to buy list, which is thousands of items, but something that ranks pretty high up there, is a decent sized capacity portable MP3 player. And not even for immediate use, just to hold on to. Because if my car stereo ever dies, or I end up having to get another car, and it's not going to come with a CD player, and it's going to just have an input jack for either a portable MP3 player or a smartphone kind of thing, which is how people are playing their audio now, I guess, their personal audio. I have something, something at least, I think at least like a 200 gig hard drive would be nice on an MP3 player. I don't know if they made them quite that big, but that would be something that would work for me. So I don't know what the future of this listening is, and if I'm wasting a lot of my time making these MP3 discs, and a week from now my car stereo dies and I can't replace it. Whatever. Boy, this is a ramble, and I haven't pulled any music. Well, what to do? Let me pull something fast. At least one thing. I'm gonna pull one thing, and it's not gonna be. Oh crap! I can't. Well, this is odd. Well, if I can only have one album, this might be it. I didn't even realize I put this back in the stack. This was sitting over there on the top of the shelf for months. And I finally decided to put it back in the stack. I don't know if I ever did a random pull of this, but I've spoken enough about this. This is the album, above all other albums, that I wanted to be re-released on CD the most. And it's the one I waited the longest to finally get put on CD. Now, when it finally came out now, it seems to me like it was a year or two ago, but I think it was more like almost 10 years ago. It can't be that long. 8 years ago, 7, I forget, that this finally did come out on CD. And being that it's a movie soundtrack and it's only 30 minutes long, was paired with another movie soundtrack that Terry Riley did called Happy Ending, I think is the name of it. And I spoke about this in great detail. It's a great album, thankfully still in print on CD. And different cover. This is just a still from the movie. And this was a blind buy. This was my first ever Terry Riley album. No idea who he was. No idea about minimalism. No idea there was any connection to Philip Glass or Steve Reich. This is before the internet. This is about 78 that I bought this. And I thought he was a European artist because I bought this in the import section. And I was just looking for something different, something instrumental, and something that looked like it may have been just created by one guy in the studio because I love that concept. And I saw the picture of the back, and I saw the great organ. I wasn't sure whether it was a Hammond or not, but the organ with the dual keys, the dual keyboards, which is my favorite keyboard of all time. One with those drawbars that changes the sound of the organ. Now, not as much as like a synthesizer sample, but there's a lot of subtle and not so subtle changes to the sound, whether it has a percussive attack, and you actually hear like a percussive sound as each key is hit, or whether it's a really soft, almost electronic sound. And so all the keyboards on here, I believe, are generated from that one organ, using different settings on it. As well as Terry does a little bit of voice. He does a little bit of tabla drums on one track, and he plays some soprano saxophone as well. But it's mostly a keyboard-heavy album. And Jesus, I'm sure you guys have bored me talking about this one. And he also uses the processing. The whole digital delay, repeated loop thing that he pretty much invented for his live performances, he uses on this as well. And it's obvious when it's on the recording, when you hear it. And it's really effective. I knew it was a loop I was hearing, but I didn't know how it was done at the time because looping didn't exist. So I guess if I'm only going to pull out one album for this edition, maybe I'll do another one. It's fitting, but that's just about my favorite album ever. I'm going to go to the other side now and try to pull something else out. You know, I'm a little afraid. I hope it's not something I have to talk about. Well. It's not an ECM album. Oh, I love this album. Kenny Burrell, the mainstream jazz guitarist who as of right now is still around. Moon and Sand. I love this album. I bought this. This is on Concord Jazz. I bought this as a new release. So it was fairly early in my love of jazz. And also fairly early in my exploration of mainstream jazz, because I got into ECM first, and I kind of expanded out from there. So this was 1980, and I remember buying this as a new release, $6.29 at Discomat. List price $8.98, and to this day, it's very well recorded, by the way. To this day, this is one of my favorite albums of the clean mainstream jazz guitar, electric jazz guitar. It's got Kenny Burrell on guitar, upright bass player John Hurd, Ron McCurdy on drum kit, and Kenneth Nash on percussion. And that extra added percussionist I really like. And it's a fairly mellow album. So the percussionists don't think like Santana percussion. Think very, very light percussion. Almost more there for atmosphere and effect than slamming a rhythm, because it's not like a real active, aggressive kind of rhythm album. It's very quiet. There's 8 tracks on there. Moon and Sand. A lot of these are well-known jazz standards for the most part. Kenny Dorham's Blue Bossa, Stolen Moments by Oliver Nelson, Love for Sale by Cole Porter, everybody's recorded that. Kurt Weill's Lost in the Stars, Billy Strayhorn track, another Kurt Weill, Ira Gershwin track, My Ship, Moon and Sand, Alec Wilder track. No originals by Kenny. But I love, this is, like the album cover suggests, this is, Kenny, I wouldn't say Kenny does a lot of low-key albums. He's not the most aggressive up-tempo of the mainstream kind of bebop jazz guitarists. He always had this to me, nicer, more lyrical side to him. So it's not surprising that this is a lower key album even for him, I think. Simply lovely album. It came out on CD, and I missed it on CD. And I was looking at buying like leftover copies on CD, and they were just going for outrageous prices. And I found that if you were to do a search for Kenny Burrell, Moon and Sand, it doesn't come up, but it was reissued in a double CD package. And instead of just titling the double CD package, the name of both of the albums that are on it, they released it under completely different names, so you won't find the Moon and Sand album by doing a search on it. You have to do a search on whatever the hell they retitled this double CD set. But it's one of the 2 albums on a double CD set. It's even got liner notes. So I was thrilled, and I even forgot that I had it on CD, and just months ago, maybe about a year ago, I went looking for it again, because I'm like, I gotta get this on CD. And again, I stumbled across these used and still sealed, which is what I prefer to buy, remaining copies of just the solo Moon and Sand album, and they were outrageously high. And then something made me go through my collection, and I found the Kenny Burrell album there. I'm like, I don't remember what this sounds like, and pulled out this Kenny Burrell CD, and realized it's a 2 CD set, and one of them is the Moon and Sand album. It must be Concord. It must be, because Concord's still around, and Concord does that. Unfortunately, they reissue some of their older albums on 2 CD sets, and they give it a completely different title. So you don't really know what's on there unless you can physically look at the thing, or the merchant that's selling them, whether it's Amazon or somebody else, has detailed notes as to what's actually on this CD. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes they don't just put on there, this is a 2 CD set reissue of blah, blah, blah. Okay, 2 vinyl pulls. I'm ripping you guys off this time, but I'll be back soon. Sorry for my tirade about MP3s. I don't know why I always thought that I would mention that at some point and talk about my lost MP3 discs. I guess because it's such a frustrating thing that I spent so many hundreds of hours making these discs, and then I lost them, and now I'm basically starting all over again. And I guess in one way or another, people can relate to that, whether it's, back in the old days I did it on cassettes, but a cassette generally would only include 2 albums, so that was not the amount of work that it would take me to compile these MP3 discs on CD. I'm sure they won't turn up now because they're in the old house, which was torn down and sold. So, but yeah, I think about that like every day. It bothers the crap out of me that I lost all these MP3 discs that I made. But I'm sure, and there's albums I left in the basement that I thought I had brought with me, and that's another video. But it's a little hard to show things that I don't have. You know, here's the album that I thought I brought with me, but guess what? I left in the basement and it's gone now. Okay, guys. This is a good tirade, maybe to fall asleep too, huh? Okay, I'll be back too soon for most of you, and I hope everybody's doing okay. Take care, everybody. I'll be back.
Tune in next time for more
Tales from the Garage.